praise. It's still on. Okay. All right, I think we're good to go now. So I was just saying, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And at the beginning of the year, I was probably a little overly ambitious, thinking we'll look at 1 Corinthians 1 and 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians this first half of the year. And clearly we're not going to finish and get 2 Corinthians done before July. So you could probably anticipate each of the last couple chapters taking two to 3 weeks each, because there's a lot of stuff coming up really chapter 11 through the end of the book. There's a lot of stuff with a lot of questions that comes up, a lot of issues that people have varying opinions on. So we're going to take our time, and we're still planning on going into 2 Corinthians next, but we'll probably take our time, make sure we give proper attention to some of these difficult chapters in 1 Corinthians, and just really take our time through it. All right, well, I'd ask if you would bow with me at this time, and we will get our Bible class going in the proper way with a prayer. Our wonderful and mighty Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this day, with eagerness and excitement, ready to open your word, ready to learn about you and understand you better, ready to be sharpened by your word, that we might be better prepared to reflect your light in our lives, that we might be a more complete reflection of the life of your Son, Jesus. And we thank you for keeping the Bible for us, that we have such easy access to it today, that it has been preserved for thousands of years, and we still have that access to you, to know of you and to know of your will for our lives. Please bless us in our study this morning, and we pray that our study and our worship throughout this morning and throughout this day will be pleasing to you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so chapter 10, the briefest of reviews. We begin chapter 10, and this is the culmination of 3 chapters of teaching, if you will. Now, chapters are not there originally, and so you ought to just ignore them. But as we account it, 3 chapters of teaching. And so chapter 8 was this idea that he understood and was probably, I can't say for certain, but was probably quoting some of the Corinthian knowledge, or as I call it, Corinthian slogans, things that maybe he's quoting little snippets of stuff they wrote to him, because we know it's a two-way correspondence, we just don't have the other half of it. And so it could be that he's quoting them, and he talks about their knowledge, and they know that idols are nothing. There's only one God. They understood that, but they're taking that knowledge, and their applications are causing some damage. Chapter 8, he talked about you could harm others. You know, if the weak sees you dining in an idol's temple, well, could that be a situation where he sees you and his weak conscience is emboldened to go back into idolatry? Because for him, he doesn't have that same knowledge as you. Chapter 9, he says the gospel could be harmed. The effectiveness of the gospel. And that's why Paul used himself as an example in chapter 9 of, I'm not asking you to do anything I don't already do. When he said at the end of chapter 8, if food makes my brother stumble, never again will I eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. If something I'm doing through my knowledge causes another to sin or leads them to potentially sin like this example here, Paul says, I'll give it up. And chapter 9, he says, look, I've given up taking along a believing wife. I have that right, but I don't exercise it. I have a right to be paid. And that's something Jesus commanded. He uses very firm language about it. He says, I haven't insisted on that because I don't want to disqualify myself, and I don't want to harm the effectiveness of the gospel in Corinth. So Paul uses himself as an example there in chapter 9. And then chapter 10, he began with this idea, well, you could disqualify yourself, just like Israel in the wilderness. And so he makes this comparison in the first part that Israel, freshly baptized through the Red Sea, through Moses, They were given all these blessings. They were provided for by God. They had all the things they needed to succeed. Yet because of their grumbling and complaining, because of their idolatry and sexual immorality, God was displeased with them. And the concern is that they might make some of those same choices. And so idolatry is sort of at the center of this, just like it has been throughout these 3 chapters. And now as we come back to the end here, his conclusion is flee idolatry. And we look around verse 20 to 21. Verse 19. What am I saying? That an idol is anything, or what is offered to idols is anything? Rather that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot drink of the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? And that is probably a callback to Deuteronomy 32, when Moses is recounting their early history and the failures of that first generation, which is appropriate, how he began this chapter talking about that first generation failing in the wilderness. So his conclusion here is that knowledge has taken them to a very bad place. And he makes it very clear. He talks about the Lord's Supper, and that's something that's going to come up again in chapter 11. And he talks about how, isn't that a sharing in? Well, what am I saying? That idols are anything? No, but what is behind an idol? There's no Zeus, there's no Apollo, there's no Aphrodite, but where do those kinds of beliefs, where do they originate from? What is the source here? There is an evil behind it. Satan, demons. It comes from the liar, the deceiver, the accuser. So, yes, you're correct in saying that, no, there's no real God behind that idol, but there is real evil behind it. And so that's why it's always linked to things. When you see idolatry in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, it's often linked with child sacrifice, something that God thought was absolutely abominable. One of the chief reasons why he said, when you enter Canaan, I want you to remove every last one of them, because they do these horrible abominations, sacrificing their children. It's often linked with sexual immorality. It's often linked with covetousness, which is how the New Testament defines it. So it is still a huge problem, idolatry today, as a form of covetousness. Gil.
We seem to want to put this large buffer, gray area, God, faith, and sin, and righteousness. And really, you're either with God or you're not. And what this is illustrating, it says, don't share a cup with the demon. Well, people say, well, I don't. I just do this. That's that gray area. No, you're not sharing it with God. You're sharing it with people.
Yeah. And I think you're right that Paul does force a conclusion here that Corinthians, you're trying to inhabit some sort of middle ground, and I'm telling you it doesn't exist. It's the cup of demons or it's the cup of the Lord, and you can't have it both ways. And I think that's sort of the point here too, is that on the outside they might be dining in these idols' temples and thinking, well, there's nothing to it, I'm not worshiping this God. But your outward actions must match your inward convictions. Otherwise, you're dishonest, you're duplicitous. And Paul is trying to take that off the table here. So I think this is a definitive statement, verse 21. You cannot drink of the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons. I find this to be a definitive statement that the practice of dining in the idol's temple, in the eyes of God, was wrong. That you have crossed a line. Your knowledge might say there's nothing to it, but that doesn't work in the eyes of God. Yeah, I'm going through the motions of idolatry, but I'm not really believing it. Does that work with God? I think his answer here is no. Now, this is where we left off with last week, and as we look at verse 23 through the end of the chapter, this is where some practical questions come up. Because the generic question is not about dining in the idol's temple. That's a specific application that has come up in this conversation, but the more generic question is eating the meat. Is that wrong in all contexts? Because their knowledge is correct. There's nothing behind that idol, and if all you're doing is just buying meat and eating it, is that a little different circumstance? That's sort of the question I'm getting here when we look at verse 23 through the end of the chapter. So this is where Paul is going to address, well, what about in the home? Really quick, let me just point out again verses 23 and 24. All throughout Paul's conclusions in these 3 chapters has been give up. Give up a right, which you might perceive as a right. Do what is in the interest of others, not yourself, which is the very textbook definition of Christ-like. Sacrificing, and that's why Paul talked about that in chapter 9. Paul said, I made sacrifices because it was in your best interest spiritually. And that's what he's asking us to do. So verses 23 and 24 again reiterates that point. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. And then verse 23, I just wanted to back up. This could be another example, again, could, of a Corinthian slogan. All things are lawful for me. It could be that Paul is simply summarizing the idea that the law and customs of Moses are past, and so food restrictions and things like that are gone. And he could be referencing that all things are lawful for me now. But it just feels more appropriate for me, and I get the feeling that this is another Corinthian slogan where they say, well, and maybe they're misquoting Paul or taking him out of context. Well, Paul, you said all things are lawful. Paul, I thought you taught us about that the customs of Moses are gone and now all things are lawful. And it could be something that they maybe used against him or used in one of their letters, but his response would be, but not all things are helpful. And again, we shouldn't read into this as a blank check. Not everything, as in everything under the sun, is lawful. Adultery, not lawful, nor is it beneficial. But not everything is lawful. So I think this sounds like a misunderstanding on the Corinthian part, but I'm not going to be dogmatic about that. But you see the back and forth. Even if something is lawful, even if by your knowledge you understand the truth of it, you got to ask that question. Is this in their best interest? Is this helpful to others? You can be right and still lose. You can be right and still be wrong. Go ahead.
Just because something is lawful, it's lawful for me to eat meat. Does that help other people to that position? And it may not be. You may have a right to do something. It may not be helpful to something.
Right. So, and to illustrate this idea that there are situations where it is a liberty. It is perfectly lawful to eat the meat sacrificed to idols. But even still, that doesn't mean that it is a blank check that, well, okay, any situation, any circumstance, any location says, no, this is the governing principle here. And the Bible often gives us those governing principles, that it's not a list of categorized rules or codified commandments, though there are commandments in the Bible for sure, but we have to look for guiding principles sometimes too. And I love this illustration when it comes to driving. There are situations on the road that I don't know what to do. In a school zone, it feels like a trap. And I've been trained by Oregon, where you step out of line, they're going to write you a ticket. That's how they make their money in Oregon. I've been trained by that. And it just feels like it's entrapment. 25 miles an hour when children are present. What does that mean? Present on the premises? Present after school hours? Present on this side of the fence? Or what if they're present but they're at recess behind the fence? When is the school zone in effect? I don't know, but I've never gotten a ticket. Because I usually slow down when school's in, whether I should or shouldn't, because I'm being a cautious and defensive driver. At two-way intersections, two-way stops, when cross traffic doesn't. If I get here and the guy's going here this way. He's turning left, so he's going to go in front of me. He's there first, but I'm going straight. Does straight get right of way, or does who gets there first get right of way? And you might think, well, that's an obvious answer. Well, maybe I'm just a dummy, but I'm not entirely sure. But you know what? I've never been in an accident in those situations. Because even if I think I have the right of way, I'm still being defensive. So defensive, that's what my dad taught me. That's a guiding principle that helps me in situations where maybe I have the right of way. And there are times where I definitely have the right of way. But I don't insist on my rights because sure, I've got right of way, but if I just ram on into the car, he's at fault, but aren't I also kind of at fault? Even though I had legally the right of way, I saw it coming and I could have avoided it. That's not a good defense. Say, well, I had right of way. Yeah, but you had like 30 seconds to get out of the way. So I think this is one of those guiding principles that we just need to filter all of these situations through this lens of don't seek your own, but seek an other's well-being. So to illustrate this is where we get into the next point here in verse 25. He's going to talk about a very specific situation here that illustrates that idea of even if it is permissible, you still have to ask that question. Is it beneficial or is it harmful? If it's harmful, well, let it go. So verse 25, eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. So that's the idea here. He's saying, guys, don't overthink this. If you're just going to buy meat and you're not participating in some visible act of worship, just leave it at that. You don't have to ask a million questions. Was this offered to Apollo? Was this offered in some sort of idolatrous ceremony? It says you don't have to investigate where your meat came from. Now in Portland, they'll just tell you where it came from. Your cow's name was Christopher, and he lived in it was grass-fed, and they'll give you the whole history on it. But saying you don't have to do that level of investigation. Eat whatever's sold in the meat market, asking no questions for your conscience sake. You're just buying meat, leave it at that. Verse 27, though, introduces another wrinkle. If any of those who do not believe invite you to dinner and you desire to go, again, just like he said in verse 25, eat whatever is set before you, asking no questions for conscience sake. Again, you go to someone's house, you don't have to ask them, wait, before I take the first bite, I need to know the history of this meat. What idol was it offered to? What ceremony was it involved with? And again, sometimes that was in public temples. Sometimes it was a private shrine to their ancestors. That was another common practice that may factor into this conversation as well. He's saying you don't have to ask that question. If you're being served a meal, leave it at that. But, verse 28, if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you, and for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. So I'm going to pause right there because I think this is a parenthetical thought, and we'll look at the rest of verse 29 in a moment. It says, here's another situation, though, where you have to ask that question. What if the one who invited you to their house, what if they make it about the idol? What if they make it idolatrous? You weren't asking, you weren't investigating, but they bring it to your attention, and in their eyes, it becomes something related to that idol. He says, that's a different situation. The Corinthians might continue on with this knowledge of theirs, say, well, yeah, he thinks it's something special, but I don't. I know the truth. But whose conscience are you concerned about in this instance? Don't ask questions when meat is offered to you. Don't ask questions when you're buying it for your conscience. But in this situation, whose conscience are you concerned about? His conscience. Not your own in this instance. It's not about you having a guilty or innocent conscience. It's about he's got a innocent conscience because he thinks the gods are real. He thinks those idols represent the gods, and that these ceremonies are something that honors the gods. And his conscience is going right along with it and telling him, because your conscience is that part of you that tells you what you believe to be is right or wrong. And so his conscience is patting him on the back saying, good job. You're doing something good by honoring the gods. And if you partake of the food when he makes it something idolatrous, you are going right along and telling his conscience, good job. Keep it up. And you are confirming to him that, and I think that's the concern here, because he says in verse 29, conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other, his conscience. That's the concern here. So here is that example of where, is it lawful for you to eat meat? I'm not eating in the idol's temple. I'm just eating in someone's home. Is it, strictly speaking, all things are lawful? Sure. But is it beneficial in that situation when he makes it idolatrous? So I think that's the distinction here in this particular illustration. Now let's get the rest of verse 29 and look at the context here. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? So this is a little puzzling because on the surface it sort of appears that Paul is doing an about face. He just said, well, earlier, if meat causes my brother to stumble, I'll never eat it again. And if he makes it about idolatry, then for his conscience sake, I won't eat. But then he goes right around and says, but why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? Well, I thought we were concerned about the other man's conscience just 3 words ago. So what's going on here? And is Paul changing his opinion mid-sentence, or maybe there's something else going on? This is another instance where could be a Corinthian slogan. Could be he's anticipating their response to what that example he just outlined. Well, why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? Why should you just said, Paul, eat whatever meat is set before you. Why should my conscience be judged by, or why should my liberty be judged by his conscience if you just said it's okay to eat the meat? It could be something that he's anticipating their response. And then his conclusion would be, verse 31, therefore, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense, either to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God. Just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. So that would be sort of Paul's response. I'm not sure that's what's going on here, but that is one way people have interpreted this passage, as another Corinthian slogan. Let me offer another look at this. I'll come back to this. I couldn't think of a good way to do this. I'm not that good at PowerPoint, so I'm going to have to go forward and then go backwards. But if we look at this, so the New Living Translation and other translations reflect this, and punctuation isn't there. So don't look at this as adding something that's not there, just like the quotation marks that the ESV includes. Their idea is that we're not adding something that isn't there, where punctuation wasn't part of the original text to begin with, but it is implied that this is a quote. And we see lots of quotations. When the Bible quotes the Old Testament, English Bibles put quotation marks in there that aren't there in the Greek. So don't think it's something insidious or shocking. And so it's just a suggestion. You see the parentheses there, verses 28 through the first half of 29. And it feels very much like a parenthetical, because verse 28 says, well, but if someone says to you, it sort of interrupts Paul's point of, if you're at someone's house and they offer you meat, just eat it. Now, however, parenthetical, sidebar, and if we just sort of take it out of the picture for a moment, remove the parenthetical thought and look at, here's a complete thought. Eat whatever is offered to you without raising question of conscience. For why should my freedom be limited by what someone else thinks? And you see how that completes the thought? We've got a parenthetical that is like Paul says, well, okay, yeah, here's another situation, but let's get back to this thought here. Eat whatever's offered, and don't ask questions for conscience sake, because your liberty isn't judged by what other people think. Now, let's go back. What if it's not something they think? What if it's not a matter of conscience, a matter of hypotheticals? What if they make it real and say, this was offered to Zeus, and let's give thanks to Zeus now? And they're making it idolatrous. It's not about what they think anymore. It's about what they're actually doing and including you in. And go back to the earlier conclusion. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and the table of demons. And that's what this guy has now made it into. So I hope that makes some sense too, because it is kind of a puzzling couple of verses here, just the way things are ordered. But let's go back here. Oops. And we'll just put that conclusion up there. Just one final time in verse 33. Just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. Just keep reading. Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. That's the whole point of chapter 9. Paul saying, I set an example myself. So imitate me as I imitate Christ. And what I want you to take away is that this is, again, as has been his conclusion throughout these chapters, it is again his final conclusion. Your primary question is about what is in the interest of others over self. And again, Philippians chapter 2. That is the very definition of being Christ-like. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interests of others. That's Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4. So I think that is how we wrap up this unit of teaching there and what it meant in the Corinthian context. Summarizing, I think that what he's saying here is, your external actions have to match your internal convictions. Idols are nothing. So he says, flee idolatry. Don't participate in idolatrous worship. Don't eat in the idol's temple. Others will see you. You'll cause damage to others. That's a problem. If you're just buying meat in the marketplace, you don't have to ask 100 questions and investigate it. Just buy it. If you go to someone's house and they put a plate of food in front of you, you don't have to ask where it's from, because your liberties aren't judged by what someone else thinks. And that's where people like to run wild with this. Someone might not like some of my conclusions, but that doesn't mean they get to dictate what I do in my own home or the decisions I make. We're not held hostage by what someone else thinks. But when they make it about idolatry, just like when you go into the idol's temple, you're crossing some lines. That's where the problems arise. So they're taking their inch of liberty and running a mile with it and causing all kinds of problems. That's how I see these 3 chapters going together. So what questions, observations do you guys have after all of this? Jay?
Seems to be a theme. Start saying all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable.
Right, there's a parallel in the 6th chapter with sexual immorality.
You're going to get offense if you don't pay. Cause the stomach. Cause the stomach. It's all about edifying. The whole thing is talking about edification.
Yeah.
Training one's conscience, not encouraging idolatry. Not protecting, but also not encouraging idolatry. Teaching moments that go along with it, or confirming their conscience.
Right, and that's the concern with this situation, this what-if scenario that Paul brings up at the end of the chapter, is if you're in someone's home, and let's say they offer you food, well, just eat it. But let's say they tell you, this was offered to idols. Well, don't eat it then for the sake of his conscience. You're concerned about confirming his convictions. I don't want to give support to his idolatry. Yeah. So what is in his best interest? Well, confirming idolatry and showing him that it's okay to just continue as an idolater, that's not in his best interest. It might make it less socially awkward for me. Maybe I just don't want to walk away from a good-looking meal, but if he makes about idolatry, I got to think about what's in his best interest, and that's a scenario where you got to say, thanks, but no thanks. I don't have anything to do with idols, and you shouldn't either. Brady.
Teaching flies against the zeitgeist of the time, which is my right.
Right.
I'll do this. My right. You can't tell me I can't. My right. About me. It's all about me.
Yeah, you might say this is kind of an un-American principle here. Yeah, and again, we need to keep in mind that the subtle, it's not a huge distinction, but it's a important enough subtle distinction between this and Romans 14. Romans 14 is about matters of moral indifference. Sabbath, eating meat, eating unclean foods, things like that, where it's neither right or wrong. You're neither good or bad if you partake or abstain in those things. That is entirely about matters of conscience, and even there he says you shouldn't push someone to violate their conscience. And so, Christmas is a good one. I've had interactions with other Christians that think that any mention of Christmas is wrong, and I agree that we don't celebrate it as a church. It's not something that, we celebrate the idea of Jesus and what his birth meant and what his life meant and what his work accomplished. So in a sense, we celebrate Christmas all throughout the year, but as a holiday, as a specific day observed in the church, it's not something in the Scripture. And so I agreed with some of these folks but they would tell me that I shouldn't have a Christmas tree in my home. Christmas, you break down the word, is Christ. Mass, it's Catholic in origin. We shouldn't have anything to do with it. And I just responded back, say, well, do you really think someone comes into my house, sees a Christmas tree, and assumes I'm Catholic? Do you really think someone sees my kids dressed up on October 31st and assumes we're Satanists because we're celebrating Halloween? Yes, it had bad origins. And say, go back 500-600 years when they were hunting witches and it was a really big deal, and maybe you shouldn't be celebrating Halloween in that situation. Today, though, it doesn't have that same connotation. It's got bad origins. So I don't feel like I need to be held hostage by what they think. I have a different conclusion on it, but I still need to be concerned that maybe I don't invite them over to my house in the month of December when I got all the Christmas garb up and sort of shove it in their face. Maybe I respect them. And, there's people who told me I shouldn't even say the word Christmas, so around them I just said December 25th. That doesn't mean when they weren't around, I went right back to calling it Christmas. So, that's the Romans 14 side, which carries over a little bit into this chapter. But again, the subtle distinction is those are matters entirely of conscience. These are matters that do get into sinful situations. If you are leading someone to stumble, in particular here, if you're leading them into idolatry, confirming their innocent conscience when it should be convicted, that's wrong. If someone sees you in the idol's temple, it's wrong for you to be there, and they're going to see you and think, well, it's okay, and so they'll fall back into idolatry. You're leading them to sin. That's the subtle difference between this and Romans 14, but they're very similar in a lot of ways. Gil? Yeah, the burden in these scenarios that talk about weak and strong, burden usually falls on the strong. And that's just how the Bible describes it. And I think Brady's absolutely right. It kind of doesn't fit with the cultural zeitgeist. It's kind of that anti-American don't tread on me kind of thing. And so again, we don't want to get in these scenarios where people, by what they think, try to control every aspect of our lives. That's taking it too far one way. But I would just say, when you look at these chapters, your main takeaway should be, time and time again, Paul says, filter your scenarios, every scenario you face, filter it through this lens of what is in God's best interest and what is in their best interest. And then self-interest comes last. Because that's what he says here in verse 33. I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. We give no offense to either Jews or Greeks or to the church of God. I'm concerned with how this might affect the reputation of the church or the name of Christ. And so my main concern is, how does this glorify God? How does it edify or build up another? And then sort of put yourself at the end of that priority list. It doesn't mean, well, I think that should be your main takeaway. I'll just leave it at that. I think that's the main takeaway from these 3 chapters. Filter these scenarios. When you have questions like this, filter it through that lens first. Shane?
Struggling with the idea of what's sin, what's not. Sin for one person, not a sin else. And so I guess I'm struggling with that, with things being kind of black.
Well, and that's where you might get more into Romans 14 would be better suited for that kind of question, because some people, their conscience, maybe they don't think it's sin, but their conscience still feels guilty. So it's not a perfect fit there either. But all I'll say is that you do have some scenarios, like that Christmas example. These other people I've talked to or encountered throughout the years, to them, it was a sin issue. To me, it's not. This text is a little different. Paul clearly defines it as this is a sin issue, and so you have an apostle telling you, you guys should know better. So that sort of sets this out. Those are tough to navigate situations. I'll totally admit that. That is tough to navigate when one side thinks it's sin, the other doesn't, and that's your disagreement on whether something's sinful or not. That's really complicated. I'm not sure it's specifically under the guidance of this chapter. Gil, you made a face. Let's.
It's got to be part of it. I mean, if I believe that walking across the street is a sin, silly, foolish, no basis in understanding or knowledge, but if I truly believe that, and you come up and take my arm and guide me across the street, you're leading me into sin because of what I believe. That's the whole point of why we try to teach, try to help people grow. We run into it most often nowadays when it comes to opinions. You have an opinion, I have a difference of opinion. Well, I'm pretty confident that you spent a lot of time looking at God's Word to come to your conclusion, your opinion, based upon what you understand God's Word to be. Hopefully you feel that way about me, and yet we differ.
Yeah. So let me come back to this illustration of the being a defensive driver, the principle here. There are going to be some situations where two sides, and there are definitely some issues in the Bible. You just come up with a lot of them. There's some that think drinking alcohol is absolutely sinful, regardless of any circumstance, any amount, any volume, it's sin. You got folks that believe that. You got folks that, acknowledge drunkenness is a sin, but not all circumstances is sinful. That's one issue. Tattoos, length of clothing. You get all those issues that to one side is black and white sin. The other side is, well, hold on now. I don't quite see it the same way. So there are a lot of difficult scenarios that I could think of off the top of my head. I'll get to you in just a second, Anna, and then Carl. I think this principle still fits, though. I'm not going to let them control me in every situation in my life. But in my interactions with them, I am going to think about what is in their best interest. I can't tell you exactly what the answer to that question is, but I think we always need to be thinking Christ-like. What is in God's best interest? What will glorify Him? And what is in their best interest? What will edify them the most? And every situation could be different. Sometimes that could be, as Gil said earlier, trying to strengthen their weak conscience. trying to study through it. And there's always an option to study through those questions. Is that going to work? Oftentimes, no. But I always want to think about what's going to glorify God, what will build them up. And so that's the lens we always filter these things through. You want to follow up on that, Shane, before I... Okay, Anna? Yeah. And that's the Romans 14, is Romans 14 makes it clear. Your conscience can be misinformed. So unlike Pinocchio, your conscience is not always the perfect guide, but you should never do something that violates your conscience because you want that part of you to speak up. Even when it's misguided, you try and train it better, but you're right. Romans 14 says never violate it. So go ahead. And that's where, again, do you let someone control every aspect of your life because maybe you are on this side that says, well, it's not wrong in all aspects or in all circumstances, but I know this person thinks it is. I'm having them over to my house. Maybe I won't put a glass of wine out for them. Maybe tonight. So I'm not saying they control every aspect of my life, that I will never drink in any circumstance if I think it's okay, but maybe I'm not going to force the issue around their conscience. Maybe that could be one way of solving some of those issues. But Carl? Right. Right. Yeah. Well, again, I think it's some settings, though. Eating the meat is the general question. There are specific applications, I think, in the idol's temple. Well, yeah. Well, I would say it's you cannot drink of the cup of the Lord and cup of demons, eat of the table of the Lord and table of demons. I think idolatry is the sin, but I think conscience is, I think there's two layers to it, is my understanding of this. But I totally agree about the conscience, and that's the Romans 14 side of it coming in, that you should never tell your conscience. That's how you get a seared conscience. When you start ignoring your conscience when it speaks up, well, it becomes seared and it stops working. And I think that's the danger of violating your conscience or someone else's. Yeah, and maybe I'm just not understanding you precisely, but I want to get to Todd before the last bell goes off. I'll chew on that one a little bit.
it was beneficial to cut this. Once everything from rules is really awesome. So
Right.
by doing a simple act like that, I love it. We got no conversation. It's kind of funny. There are parents over here on this side, and they're good kids and good players. That's how I take it.
Yeah.
Scriptures again tell us, you know, willing to heal.
Well, and that's where we come back to some of his conclusions in chapter 9 about all things to all men. To the Jew I became as a Jew, to the Greek as to a Greek. And then again, the conclusion of all of it in chapter 10, verse 33, I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit. And so, did you cook pork chops after sometime later? Yeah, and so his conscience doesn't dictate your behavior going forward, but in that interaction, you made a choice to respect his conscience, and I think that did some good as far as opening doors of dialogue. So that's a good illustration of it. Thank you. So we'll work our way through this and into chapter 11 next week, and thank you, everybody.